The concentration of wealth within the country. I mean, we have many poor people, but we also have a very, very significant number of people who are so rich. So there is a problem of concentration of wealth and the lack of opportunities for many people. But we also have to look at the systems of trade and also the collapse of many manufacturing industries in the country, which has also led to a shortage of jobs.
Well, Mark Thompson in Hong Kong, carrying on this particular point, we're looking at outside factors involved here economically. The collapse of certain industries within the Philippines, the point that we heard there about the use of Philippine expatriate workers in other countries, outside countries having a responsibility for this very question of poverty itself.
Right, well, I'm here in Hong Kong, and of course there's a huge Philippine population in this city, many of them domestic workers, and this is, of course, in large part driven by the fact that these domestic workers, largely women, don't find adequate employment in the Philippines. They come to Hong Kong often overqualified for the jobs they do. So clearly poverty plays a role. Globalization has affected the Philippines very strongly. As has been mentioned, the Philippines has lost a lot of important industries. On the other hand, it's gained new employment, for example, in the call center industry. But that's the kind of employment that you have to be better educated for. So there's been a gap between the Philippine economy, which is growing again and doing better in recent years, on the one hand, and on the other hand, continued inequality, in particular difficulties with access to education. I think an additional factor that's also been mentioned, but it's worth saying a little bit more about, is the issue of corruption. And the current government, the government of President Aquino, has stressed how important it is to fight corruption, to get the Philippine economy, the Philippines as a country, going again. And this affects this question of the sex trade, because corrupt officials, corrupt police, and so on have turned a blind eye to this. So, well, the government's policies, which, to be fair, have always been quite strict about sex tourism, have had difficulties when it comes to implementation.
Well, at this point, let's take a look at some details. According to the 2010 U.S. Department of State's report on trafficking in persons, the Philippines is a source, transit, and destination country for human trafficking. The report said that, and I quote, "The government of the Philippines does not fully comply with the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking. However, it is making significant efforts to do so." And in this year's report, the Philippines is moved off the State Department watch list and upgraded to a Tier 2 status that recognizes the government's efforts to combat sex trafficking while maintaining that more still needs to be done. But the U.S. Justice Department maintains that even when legislation is passed, it is ineffective because on many occasions it is not enforced against tourists, and the department also raises the issue of police corruption in particular countries. It says, and I quote, "Efforts to combat child sexual exploitation often run into conflict with foreign governments' efforts to promote the international tourism industry. Police corruption is common," it continues. "In Thailand and the Philippines, police have been known to guard brothels and even procure children for prostitution." Here we have these official reports bringing up that issue of corruption and bringing up that issue of the conflict between the need for tourism and the sex industry itself. Aidan McQuaid, I'd like to bring up this particular point. Is there a conflict between tourism, bolstering an economy, and the sex industry?
Well, I think what you're seeing in the Philippines, and the dispute over the 40% mark is interesting itself, because what that tends to indicate is that the issue is not being adequately investigated. The fact that they have a dispute about this statistic means that the issue is not being adequately investigated to such an extent that you have got hard, reliable statistics and everybody can agree on the scale of the problem. I think that speaks then to the question of institutions. So on one hand, we're seeing, as Mark, our other colleagues mentioned, some quite good policies on the part of the Filipino government, but then a failure of those to be implemented. So it's difficult to make the will of the government run through the country while the institutions themselves are weak. I think this then speaks to international governments as well, because if we're talking about, we must be able to know, or know very easily, who are the people who come to the Philippines as tourists, And we should be looking at those countries where they're coming from and asking, do those countries have extraterritorial legislation which would allow their citizens to be prosecuted if they engage in the rape of children overseas?
Well, this is a critical point. Clearly, the US, for example, has the US Protect Act of 2003, which does allow for the prosecution of Americans who conduct sex crimes abroad. Mark Thompson, though, is there sufficient international legislation in those countries that provide the tourists to give an added muscle both to the host country and to those countries that the tourists come from?
Well, again, there is some good legislation out there. I think another country worth mentioning is Australia, in which there's been a lot of consciousness raising recently, a lot of discussion about tourism, and the Australian government has been very active in that regard. Crucial, I think, is the cooperation between countries where the tourists go and countries where they come from. And I think the Philippines, again, has done pretty well in that regard, working with the Australians, working with the Americans and other countries. And there have been a few high-profile cases. But again, it always gets down to the particulars and the particular areas that are notorious for even child sex, and nothing is done because a corrupt official covers it up. The Philippine press is active. NGOs are very active in the Philippines. So there is an ongoing battle, as it were, between those who would try to do more on this issue and those who have an interest in covering it up. International legislation plays a role, but without cooperation of local authorities, it's very difficult, of course.
Yes, to pick up on that particular point concerning Australia, last year there were 19 Australian tourists on one particular occasion refused entry because of their sexual conduct records. But that wider issue, Amihan Abueva in Manila, the question of whether or not the government is actually doing enough, not in terms of passing legislation, which it has, but in applying legislation, which some claim it is not. Do you think that this is the case, that it is not practicing its own legislation strongly enough?
Well, the country is a really large one. I mean, what the policymakers are saying in Manila is that we do have excellent laws protecting children, but the problem is the implementation. And what we've found is that we really have to go from city to city, from tourist spot to another, just to make sure that the authorities and the owners of resorts and hotels are aware of the laws. I mean, the Senate, Congress have passed a lot of good laws, but the problem is very little effort still to make sure that at the city level or the particular resort areas that these laws are actually disseminated and enforced, and that people know where to go. So that's often a problem. Sometimes people report cases to us, but when we report them back to the police, it seems that sometimes police don't know what to do.
Well, to stick with you on that particular point, Amihan Abueva, is it a question of they do not know what to do, or is it a question of there being innate corruption within some of the police departments?
Well, it's probably both, because I would think that it would be impossible to have really large-scale sex tourism without the complicity of key government officials, especially the key officials within the police forces. But when it comes to the policeman on the beat, the person who has to respond to the cases, oftentimes you have a problem that they really don't know what to do. And we actually have to help them know where they have to report and so on, and what kind of evidence has to be gathered. So it's a big problem, because on one hand, there's this policy, but on the other hand, you have a lot of police, which are still very macho, who still think that it's a very minor problem, and they're often also on the take.
Well, Ida McQuaid, in London, earlier on you brought up that question about the dehumanization of people who are subject to the sex trade, who become part of it against their will. This issue of dehumanization, is this an internal issue? You said it's something that the government should address, or is it something that is far wider than that?
It's much wider than that. If you look at the history of slavery over the course of human history, in fact, there tends to be a combination of, in order to establish systems in which people can be exploited, there needs to be a myth around those people describing them as something that are less than human, and the whole growth of racism within Western culture is probably the most classic example of that. But just to go back a little bit to one of the points Abriya was making in terms of policing and corruption, it reminds me very much of a debate about community policing and democratic accountability of policing within